We're extremely happy to have David Laibson with us. David is professor of economics at Harvard, involved in a large number of initiatives, well known for a number of things. For me, and probably for some others, one of the most profound things we learn in grad school is when you look at the traditional life cycle model and it has delta in it, and then suddenly you just had that beta in front of delta. And it looks so simple, and it has such profound changes on behavior that you think this is the right way to go, right? You start from the traditional model, you add a small deviation that matches a lot of the behavior we observe, and then we carry this into the standard model that we're using, and then we hope others, and David has continued to do that, bring up new things that we need to add to that model to make it even more realistic. So David has been also very influential in his work on using all sorts of choice architecture or trying to understand how choice architecture impacts behavior. So we're very happy to have you, and we'll look forward to your presentation. Thank you, David.
Thanks a lot. I'm really glad to be here. I'm going to try to actually get us through two papers that are connected, as you'll see by the time we get to the end. So our two parts are first a mea culpa, that the sorts of choice architecture that we've been studying, Bridget, James, John Bashere's, with the benefit of more and more data, we're more and more skeptical about its impact. This is not a paper about welfare, but a paper about the effect sizes. And so we'll talk about the sort of latest empirical results. And then I'll turn to a sort of alternative approach, rather than the choice architecture of nudges, where we preserve liberty. I'll talk about taking a present biased model literally, which of course no one should really do when they do policy, but we can do it abstractly in the seminar room and thinking about what you would do in a policy world if people were present biased. So we'll kind of rush through these two papers. So, you know, with Taha here, this is a room that is familiar with the kind of retreat from the initial enthusiasm about nudges. There's a wonderful paper by De La Vigna and Linos which excludes defaults and shows that if you don't allow yourself to be biased by the selection problem, that you only see the published papers, but instead see all the papers, all the studies that were done by, let's say, the North American nudge units, you find that the effect sizes are on average pretty small, in this case, 1.3 percentage points. Now, of course, automatic enrollment is a very special nudge. It's one that's received a lot of attention. And Steve Dubner in 2019 described it as one of the most successful nudges and the greatest triumph to date of behavioral economics. But as Taha and others here know, those effects are likely much less outstanding than we perhaps thought they were at the beginning of this literature. So I'm going to talk about a paper today, the first one of two, that kind of documents all the reasons why the effect sizes that were kind of often imagined, measured, etc., are probably far from the reality of how materially these automatic enrollment and other auto-feature nudges are changing behavior. This is joint work with James Choi and Jordan Camarota, who's a doctoral student at Berkeley, Richard Lombardo, who is applying to graduate school, so everyone should keep their eye open. His applications will be in your inbox soon. He's applying this fall, and John Bashere's. So I'll be talking about the U.S. retirement savings system account, the 401k account. As I think everyone here knows, it's tax advantaged. It's funded by employee payroll deduction. There's an employee contribution. There's an employer match. Typically, while you're employed, the liquidity is quite minimal. You will pay a 10% penalty to take money out while you're employed, but typically your employer won't let you do that. You'll have to explain that you have hardship, and it's generally something that most people don't do. But when you separate, the floodgates open, and I'll talk a lot about that today. Now there's two automatic savings policies that are especially actively discussed. One is automatic enrollment, and that's, I think, something that everyone is familiar with. The other is a little less commonly discussed, which is default auto-escalation. And so this is not opt-in auto-escalation. This is a plan where everyone is automatically enrolled in automatic escalation as a new employee. And typically, these days, those programs have a 1 percentage point lift every year as you reach another horizon since you were hired, another annual horizon since you were hired. And lots of countries, including Canada, have adopted these policies. So they're very, very popular in the US. I'm sure this is familiar to you, so I won't go into the details. Indeed, they've been codified in various statutes. We have the 2006 Pension Protection Act, and then an even more aggressive Secure 2.0, which now mandates that new 401k plans must have automatic enrollment and automatic escalation. Okay, now, when we first began studying these phenomena, we wrote sentences like this, and I'm gonna, say mea culpa. We were overly optimistic about the effect sizes that we would eventually observe, because the early data looked promising, and I'll show you some of that early data. We said things like, employers have a large measure of control over the savings choices that their employees make. Defaults will strongly influence the retirement preparation of their employees. So we were looking at data like this, data that Taha has vastly improved and modeled in the years since. But here's some of the early data, and we knew that when you automatically enroll people, enrollment rates pop to nearly 100%, whereas the cohort in black that is not automatically enrolled slowly enrolls over time. Now, you see a lot of catch-up even at the 1-year horizon, let alone at the 4-year horizon here. So definitely the folks that are not automatically enrolled are catching up, but it takes some time for them to catch up. So there's this kind of sense in the early literature that the effects were potentially pretty promising. But there were results like this back in the early literature. So again, this is from the 2004 paper, showing that the ratio of balances to income for the automatically enrolled cohort, which we see starting at the beginning of time, which is the crosshatch data here, and the population that is not automatically enrolled, well, they do show convergence. Now we're looking at balances, so balances over income. They do show convergence at a lot of firms when you go out to about 4 years. And so that's the fact that people are eventually enrolling, and when they do enroll, they often enroll at higher savings rates, and so that two sets of effects produce this convergence in total wealth accumulation. So we knew at the beginning that with respect to automatic enrollment, probably there wasn't going to be much long-run effect on wealth formation because of this early evidence, and Taha has wonderful papers showing much more evidence pointing in that direction. Now, the thing that I think we were most excited about in the early days of the literature was auto-escalation. And this is the idea from Thaler and Benartzi that, well, we don't just auto-enroll people, we actually get people on an escalator, and we automatically put them on that escalator, and they get carried up to higher and higher savings rates. Now, these studies in the beginning weren't actually kind of RCTs, but they were sort of convincing, and this is one of the most influential studies in that line of work. And you see here the cohort. Now, I'm going to use a pen because with all these screens, I can't point to any screen. So you see a cohort here that's starting at about a 3% savings rate, and they're getting auto-escalated 3 percentage points per year. And on average, this cohort, despite a few people dropping out, ends up with a savings rate by year 4 that's nearly 14%. And so it looks like we're getting 11 percentage points of lift from auto-escalation. Now this was a very special, weird firm, very small firm. Nevertheless, it was data like this that drove the intuition that maybe auto-enrollment with auto-escalation was going to be the huge hammer that would drastically change wealth formation. So Bernarzi and Thaler come up with estimates like automatic escalation is raising the national savings rate by 3% to the extent that it's widely deployed.
But David, let me ask a question. We're seeing increases in savings. That's arguably an important intermediate input into the only thing we care about, welfare, expected welfare. Do we have any sense that this is improving welfare?
So this is not a paper about welfare. Taha's got a structural model about welfare, and that's, I think, aligned with what I'm going to say here, which is there aren't welfare effects, mostly because there aren't savings effects.
Yeah.
But I'm going to show you a welfare paper in the second half of the talk, and that will take on the question of welfare and argue that if we want to affect welfare, at least under the assumptions that I'm going to show you, and they're very, critical assumptions, so we can discuss those assumptions and debate whether we think they're realistic, that maybe a more paternalistic retirement savings system would do a good job. But that'll be the second half.
But is there ever any justification just for increasing savings? If not, that?
Well, so I agree with you. We need to have both measurement and we need to have welfare. So let me just, we're going to get there. So what are the features of the current study that I'm going to tell you about? So these are the elements that contribute the most to the kind of degradation of these savings effects. Again, not welfare effects, the degradation of these just direct effects on savings. So let's begin with high turnover workers. So in the analysis you're going to see in a moment, we're not going to drop high turnover workers. And why is that really important? Because there's a lot of high turnover in the US labor force. People are in and out of jobs all the time, especially the people that we're trying to help the most, who are kind of in the bottom half of the income distribution. About half of the workforce turns over every year in the US. These are monthly turnover rates. Now that's going to make a huge difference, because if you're trying to use auto-escalation to get people to save more, and people are out of the job in 6 months or 12 months or 18 months, then they're not going to be on that escalator for long enough to get the high levels of wealth formation, the high levels of savings rates that would produce high levels of wealth formation. Moreover, if you're out of the job quickly, given that vesting of the employer match at many firms takes years, you're going to lose the employer match because you're not around long enough to keep the match because you got vested. So that's effect one. Effect two is there's a lot of withdrawals when US workers separate from one employer and move to the next employer. Long before retirement, we're talking about just, I'm 40 years old, I'm moving from employer 3 to employer 4 in my life, I'm separating, what do I do with my 401k account balance? Well, it turns out a lot of that money leaks. Argento, Bryan, and Sablehouse were a critical early paper documenting the huge amounts of leakage. It's about 40 cents on the dollar in aggregate, but of course it's going to be higher for low-income workers. So let's take a look at some of this data, which for me, when I first saw it, was kind of heartbreaking. When we look at balances on the horizontal axis, and of course that correlates well with income, so low balances tend to also be low income. And we look at the cash leakage rate at separation for employees, again, who are not retiring, but just regular old middle of the life employees, you see that the leakage rate is nearly 100% for workers with low balances, and that has to do a little bit with what the defaults are at those low balance levels. But even for workers with balances in the $0 to $10,000 range, or the $1,000 to $10,000 range, where the default is for the money to actually go into an individual retirement account. So the default, if you do nothing, is the money rolls over and stays in the retirement savings system. We still see leakage rates of about 50%. And probably the median separating worker has a 401k balance of about $10,000. So we're looking at a lot of leakage, especially a lot of leakage for employees with low income, which were exactly the employees that we thought were going to be positively affected by these choice architecture designs. Okay, the third thing. In this study, rather than kind of naively thinking that people are completely passive and assuming that they just stay on the automatic escalation escalator, we're going to actually look at the rate at which they get off the escalator. So It turns out in 21 companies that we have data for, if we're able to track their auto escalation behavior, only 43% stay on the escalator at the first time that their savings rate is supposed to rise. And if you look at the second time their savings rate is supposed to rise, only 36% are still on the escalator, meaning 64% have gotten off the escalator, they opted out. If you look at the third horizon for an automatic increase in their savings rate, only 29% are still on the escalator. Now, these numbers are a bit contested because, well, 21 firms is not enough to draw inferences about 10,000 firms. So if I were to take all that we know about all the firms and all the record keepers, probably I'd draw a line like this, a little bit higher. But still, the point is, there's a lot of people getting off the escalators. And when we check our robustness by assuming different rates of sticking around, we find that the numbers I'm going to show you are not much affected by whether we're here or here or here. Essentially, there's so many effects that are draining away the wealth formation that the net answer is the kinds of big wealth formation effects that we thought we were going to see 20 years ago are not in the data. So we have a light data, that's a US record keeper. We start with 200 firms in our database. We identify 86 cases where auto features are introduced. We impose 3 requirements for the firms to actually be included in our study. The first one is that they adopt an auto feature only for new hires. So we've got a control group, the old hires, we've got a treatment group, the new hires, and here only the new hires are treated. Secondly, we want no policy noise to muck up our identification, so we want a clean design where we've got essentially 5 years without additional plan changes. And then finally, we need contribution rate data for the entire period. So those are our 3 inclusion criteria, and we end up with 9 firms that meet these criteria, and I'm going to show you results for these 9 firms. But a lot of the elements that I'll talk about are confirmed or triangulated with much bigger samples. So don't think that this is really just 9 firms. Everything I'm showing you is kind of reflective of stuff that we can triangulate with many larger samples of firms. This particular sample will be 118,000 employees in total. So we're going to look at firms that adopt automatic enrollment and only automatic enrollment. Now, I mentioned they have variation with respect to matching schedules, some of them, to vesting schedules, which is the degree to which you get to keep the employer match whether you leave quickly or not. And some of these have immediate vesting, some of these have delayed vesting. They have variation in the matching itself, and of course they have variation in the default savings rate. And the patterns that we see in terms of the degradation of the traditional, very strong auto features effects, we observe consistently across all these different firms with all these different policies. So I don't think that what I'm showing you is a kind of idiosyncratic effect for one or the other firm. It's a very robust effect across all the firms that we see. We also study some firms that are adding auto escalation as their policy change on top of a pre-existing automatic enrollment regime. And so we've got 2 firms in that category, and again, variation across vesting, variation, well in this case, no variation across the match, but variation across the default savings rate. And then finally, we also look at firms where they're simultaneously introducing automatic enrollment and introducing automatic escalation as the default. And so we'll be looking at some firms, 3 in this case, that are simultaneously doing both things. And sadly, whether we're looking at the first group, the second group, or the third group, all 3 groups show a drastic depletion of the sort of early optimistic effects that emerged in this literature. So, we're going to be comparing the cohort of workers that were hired in the 365 days before the plan change to the cohort of workers that were hired in the 365 days after the plan change. Sometimes we use controls, sometimes we don't use controls. It doesn't really make a difference. We're going to adopt a steady state framework. So we're going to assume that workers keep rotating from job to job to job, where every single job they work in this simulated environment is an auto feature job. So essentially, it's as if they're always being affected by auto features as they move from job to job. We're going to use a synthetic balance framework. So we're going to assume that everyone gets the same rate of return on their assets, and that's going to take out a lot of noise, because obviously if you get hired, in 2020, you get huge returns. If you get hired in 2022, you get negative returns. We don't want that noise to muck up our standard errors, so we're going to give everyone the same returns when we simulate their wealth formation. And then we're finally going to make things much easier to interpret by translating all of our results into a kind of long-run, steady-state, constant savings rate. So we'll have one number rather than having to think about how the savings rate is changing as people move through various parts of their employment experience. Okay, now when we show you the data, we're going to show you the data in a waterfall design. So we're going to begin with kind of the old style analysis, where we start with 1 year of data, and we kind of extrapolate forward what would happen if that 1 year of data were reflective of everything to come. Then we're going to get more realistic and go to 5 years of data, where we're going to be able to see more of that catch-up occurring. And we're going to see that the control group, the people that don't have the auto feature, are catching up to the people that have the auto feature. Then we're going to incorporate vesting effects, and we're going to see that that's another way in which the treatment effect is being diminished, because a lot of the people that are getting treated are not actually keeping their employer match because they leave the firm before they vest. And then finally, we're going to incorporate withdrawals, which is our so-called complete estimate, but it's still too optimistic because we're excluding more ways in which the system is crowding out wealth formation that I'll talk about later. But our complete estimate will incorporate these four different, or walk through these four different modes of analysis. Okay, so here are automatic enrollment treatment effects expressed as a lift to the savings rate. So this is the increase in the savings rate caused by exposing someone to automatic enrollment as compared to an otherwise identical worker who's hired without automatic enrollment. And we see a kind of familiar result that when you have only 1 year of data, the effect size is an increase in the savings rate of 2.2 percentage points on average. But now we kind of get more realistic and we see the catch-up effects. Now the effect falls from 2.2 to 1.84 percentage points of savings rate change. When we incorporate non-vesting, so that you don't get to go home with all of those employer match dollars if you leave early because turnover is so high, the effect size falls to 1.48 percentage points in terms of the savings rate. And then finally, when we incorporate all those people taking the money and running when they terminate or separate from the employer, the effect size, and here we're just mechanically talking not about welfare, but talking about money that stays in the retirement savings system, either at the original employer or at some rollover IRA, individual retirement account. Now the effect size collapses all the way to 0.63 percentage point. So the long run effect, not long run, but the kind of inclusive effect, incorporating all these different channels, is a third of what we saw in the kind of more naive estimate. And if you want to benchmark that, here's the kind of average savings rate in these plans for the control group. And so it's a lift of 0.63 percentage points of savings rate on a baseline of 3.33 percentage points of savings rate. So that last number is not an effect size, that's a base for comparison. Okay, now we want to go to the other two columns in this table, but to do that I've got to add one more analytic frame. So in addition to thinking about auto-enrollment, when we think about auto-escalation, we've got to make assumptions about how long people stay on the escalator. And the kind of old-style assumption that people tended to make was that people had an 85% likelihood of staying on the escalator. We now know that's wrong. So it's not an 85% likelihood of staying on the escalator, but we're going to adopt that in our first piece of waterfall analysis. But then we're going to do all the other pieces the way we did before. We're going to go and look at the actual fraction of people staying on the escalator, which is not 85%, but is more like 50%. We're going to go out to 5 years of data, and we'll see the catch-up of the people that are not being automatically enrolled. They're not just passively sitting around, they're actually joining the plan, but slowly, as you saw on those early slides. We're going to incorporate vesting as we go further into the complete analysis. And then finally, we're going to incorporate withdrawals. And so we'll see the degradation as we make the analysis more and more realistic. Okay, so now we're in column 2 of the table I showed you before, but now we have that first row populated. So if we assume an 85% likelihood of staying on the escalator for automatic escalation, our estimate in this case is a lift relative to the control group. The lift here is 1.8 percentage points of savings as a steady state increase in your savings rate. But if we actually look at the true rate of staying on the escalator, which is not 85%, it's more like 50%, then that number falls to 0.82 percentage points of savings. And if we look at 5 years of data and see the catch-up of the cohorts that were not originally auto-enrolled and auto-escalated in this case, then it's 0.66 percentage points of saving. And if we incorporate the effects of not being vested for these two firms, it's 0.6 percentage points of saving as the total lift. And if we then incorporate the reality that a lot of money leaves the plan when people separate and doesn't go to an IRA, but goes just into a cash distribution, now the effect size is just 0.28 percentage points. And so we've gone down, by a factor of 7 or 8. And again, to compare to a baseline, the baseline for the control group here is 6.46 percentage points of savings as an annual rate of savings. So the lift here is pretty small. Sure, there's a lift, but based on this analysis, the lift is just an increase in the savings rate of 0.28 percentage points relative to a baseline savings rate of 6.46 percentage points. Now let's go to the last column. We're now going to start both automatic enrollment and automatic escalation together for the treatment group and compare that to the control group. And when we begin with the kind of most naive framework, assuming 85% of people staying on the escalator, we end up with a lift of 3.49 percentage points of savings. And now we get more realistic. We incorporate the real tendency to stay on the escalator at 1 year, and we end up with 3.12, and we incorporate the catch-up, and we incorporate the non-vesting, and we incorporate the money that flows out when people leave the firm and becomes a cash distribution, and now we're down to 0.83 percentage points. So again, a reduction in the effect, sort of a factor of 5. And compare that to the baseline savings of 3.8 percentage points. So there's some lift, but it's just not nearly the lift that that we thought was present as this literature gained momentum 20 years ago. Okay, so here are all the effects laid out by column, just what I've shown you before. We can lay them out by firm, and you see very similar patterns of declining effect sizes across all 9 firms.
Why does the control group contribution rate vary so much?
Well, these are just 9 firms. So you're looking at 4 firms here, 2 firms here, 3 firms here. So if we had much bigger samples, that would probably even out a bit. But there is a tendency for firms that do more aggressive things, especially this column and this column, to generally have populations of workers that are more happy to be saving at higher rates. So even if we had really large samples, this number would be lower than these numbers. Okay, so as I said earlier, our estimates are actually not as pessimistic as they should be, because we haven't incorporated leakage from the IRA, which is something that we're counting as money staying in the system, but we know that when money rolls over to IRAs, it leaks out. So we're ignoring that, and if we incorporated that, we'd get even more degradation. We also are not incorporating crowding effects in terms of borrowing, there's a growing body of evidence that some of this savings is crowding out other kinds of wealth formation or crowding in debt. And so if we want to incorporate that, that would additionally degrade these effects and maybe even take us so close to zero that we wouldn't be convinced that there was any net wealth formation from all of this stuff. Now, on the other hand, I do want to acknowledge that other countries, not so much Canada, though here there are diverse policies across the provinces, but let's say continental Europe, Australia, these accounts tend to be pretty illiquid. And so the ability to take the money and run, which I've complained about in the US, or at least acknowledged as a source of outmigration of these funds in the US, is not an issue in places like Germany or Australia, where there's a much tighter constraint on what is allowed with respect to outflows from these retirement savings accounts decades before retirement. So if we were to do the same analysis elsewhere, we'd find much bigger effects. But ironically, in the country where we did the most empirical work, the US, a lot of the things that we thought were true are not true. And I refer you here to Taha's 2024, I guess, forthcoming paper in the AER, which also documents a lot of these effects. So, we believe that auto features are probably good policy tools, but not nearly as beneficial as we thought. And let me come now to a welfare analysis in the second paper. So the second paper is asking, if you were going to design a retirement savings system from scratch, and you were going to incorporate one behavioral bias that we'll assume exists, and of course that's contested, but we're going to take it for granted in this paper, what would that retirement savings system look like? So here we go. We're going to incorporate present bias, just one behavioral bias. We're going to take the standard exponential discount function. So we've got, delta squared, delta to the third power. Of course, delta lives between 0 and 1 and typically is close to 1, but strictly less than 1. And we're going to add this additional discount factor beta, and based on the empirical work using structural modeling, we generally estimate that beta is well less than 1 and delta is very close to 1. So we're going to use that model and think about that to design optimal savings rates, or optimal institutions for savings policy. So just as a kind of appetizer for what's to come, there's a couple papers that we've written with various collaborators showing that it's just what you would expect, that if people were present biased, they would procrastinate in enrolling in their 401k plan. So you'd see short-run auto-enrollment effects, but eventually the people that were not auto-enrolled would catch up. But because people with present bias tend to be short on cash and tend to build up big credit card accounts, when they finally get a liquidity event, like being able to separate from the firm and take their cash distribution, they would do so. And so this pattern of seeing short-run effects and then seeing separation followed by outflows of cash is exactly what we would expect in a present biased world. Okay, so the paper I'm going to tell you about now in more detail is called Optimal Illiquidity. This is a paper with Bashairs, Joy, Chris Clayton, Chris Harris, and Bridget Madrian. And in this paper, we're basically taking the Amador, Werning, and Angeletos paper, which is in Econometrica, and adding a couple more realistic features. So it's a two-period model. Period 1 is working life. Period 2 is retirement. Consumption in period 1 will generate Udel's theta times U of C1, where theta is a true normative Tayshock, so something that scales utility up or down. And consumption in period 2 is U of C2. And in this setting, we're going to not have a Tayshock on the second period, but that's without loss of generality. We could easily add a Tayshock on the second period, and nothing I'm going to say would change. So the planner's objective for society is to maximize integrating across all the different uniform, the different individuals in society, each of whom has zero measure, the value of their individual utilities, which is theta times U of C1, where theta is this Tayshock, plus delta times U of C2, where delta is a normative discount factor. And unfortunately, the planner doesn't observe your private Tayshock. That's something they're going to have to elicit from a mechanism. The planner will know the population distribution of those Tayshocks, and the planner is able, through the tax and transfer system, to redistribute resources across actors in the economy, and that's a change from the original Angeletos Warning Amador paper. Or I'm sorry, I think it's Amador, not blanking on, it's Amador Warning and Angeletos. Yeah. Okay. Now what about the agents? The agents have present bias. So they're doing what the planner wants, except they have this one wedge. Rather than optimizing the function I have here without beta, they're taking beta into account and over-consuming in the first period. So present bias is going to cause excessive period 1 consumption, but we're going to assume that present bias is heterogeneous, so it's going to really vary in its impact across households. Some households are going to be highly distorted, those are the ones with low beta, and some households are going to be very minimally distorted or not distorted at all because they have beta close to or equal to 1. Now if everyone had the same beta value, we could use a Pigouvian correction. This is one of the results in the paper, that a Pigouvian correction, which is a penalty of 1 minus beta on early withdrawals from the retirement accounts, would approximately solve the problem that we're encountering in this economy. It doesn't solve it exactly because of the interpersonal considerations, but it solves it very closely. So if we knew everyone's beta, we could just give each person a Pigouvian correction of 1 minus beta, and that would solve the problem. But if we don't know everyone's beta, we've got the problem that we've got to elicit information about their beta by giving them bundles of options, a kind of standard mechanism design problem. So the shocking result in this paper, which I didn't see coming when we started writing it, is that for the economy that I've described, which granted is incredibly oversimplified and really an abstract object for us to debate in a seminar room and not something that we would really take to government and start making policy with. But for this abstract setting, it turns out that you can essentially achieve the second best optimum, meaning the informationally constrained optimum, with only 2 accounts. You don't need some complicated mechanism. I'll show you complicated mechanisms in a second, but if you only have 2 very simple accounts, you can essentially reproduce the most efficient outcome for the society that's informationally possible. So let me kind of illustrate the result. So first, if you give people just a liquid account and just a purely illiquid account with all sorts of savings incentives or forced saving, and we can get to the details of how that's achieved, you get a welfare increase of 6.1% relative to the laissez-faire benchmark. So we get a 6.1% increase on a money metric basis relative to the laissez-faire benchmark by giving people just this very simple 2-account system, which is the system that essentially almost all developed economies have. A perfectly liquid account, which is your checking account, and a perfectly illiquid account, which is your pension. Now, if we get fancy and we start introducing, let's say, a 3rd account, make the 3rd account a 401k style account, but not with the US 10% penalty. Let it have an optimized penalty that the planner is choosing to optimize welfare in this society. Well, it turns out the welfare gain, by adding a 3rd account with a linear penalty for early withdrawals, is essentially identical to the welfare gain we had before. Whether it's 6.105 relative to the laissez-faire benchmark, or 6.137 relative to the laissez-faire benchmark, those are meaningless in terms of their difference. So we don't gain by adding a 3rd account. Well, what about having 2 accounts where neither is extreme, either one perfectly liquid and the other perfectly illiquid, but two accounts with linear penalties. Again, essentially no improvement. Now we have a welfare gain of 6.136%. So, de minimis differences. And what about a fully nonlinear mechanism that uses all of the tools of modern mechanism design theory? Incredibly complicated, no linearity, a complete mess, impossible to explain, but, second best optimal, meaning given the information asymmetries, it's the best we can do. Well, in this economy, we only go up to 6.144%. Again, economically, no different from the extremely simple, you get a checking account and you get an illiquid pension that we started with at the top of the screen. So one of the surprises for us in this paper is how you can achieve, there's other papers that have results like this, how you can achieve something that is essentially socially optimal, that's also incredibly simple, and that happens to be the policy that that most of the developed economies in the world have already adopted, which is a fully liquid and a fully illiquid account, the latter being your retirement account. Okay, now you might be wondering what's going on, and I'll explain it now with this illustrative slide. What I've got here on the horizontal axis is the early withdrawal penalty on a hypothetical illiquid account. So the US is sitting here with a 10% penalty on the illiquid account, which is your 401k account. And the countries that have full illiquidity are sitting out here. So they're basically saying you can't have access to the retirement account until you retire. And what we're plotting on the vertical axis is the cross-sectional welfare in this economy separated by people with different beta values. Now there's a continuum of agents, so I've kind of eliminated the continuum, beta 0.3, beta 0.31, beta 0.32, etc. by just showing you a few lines so you get a sense of what's going on. The bottom line are the agents that have the worst self-control problem, 0.2. So they're really focused only on the present, they barely care about the future. And the top line, which is hard to separate, but it's in blue, is beta equals 1. So those are people that don't need any help, and anything the government does to constrain them is bad news, except there's a surprise on this slide, which is as we start increasing the early withdrawal penalty from 0 to 0.1 to 0.2 to 0.3, those households at the very top in blue are actually made better off, despite being constrained. And it may not be obvious immediately why, but the answer is people at the bottom are paying penalties for early withdrawal. And those penalties are going into the tax and transfer system and indirectly benefiting the people with beta equals 1. So as we start raising penalties, in fact, it's better for everyone. It's better for the people with low beta, and it's better for the people with high beta. Now, as we start raising penalties even more, we start getting huge welfare gains for the low beta households. And those huge welfare gains start to come as they stop paying penalties. Because it's not that helpful to have illiquid accounts with penalties that you pay to get the money out of. It's a little bit helpful because it holds you back. But it would be even better for those households to just not have the incentive to go and raid those accounts early and pay these big penalties. So as we raise the penalties to higher and higher levels, we start squeezing those low beta households and drive them to stop making early withdrawals that's actually more in their interest than taking money out and paying these penalties. And so we end up getting big welfare gains for the folks at the bottom. And now as the penalties stop being paid, well, the folks at the top now have very modest declines in welfare. But if I were to compare my beta equals 1 type with penalties of 0, perfect freedom, to my beta equals 1 type, where the penalty is 100% for early withdrawal, the welfare loss for them is minuscule. It's almost non-existent. So Taha and I were discussing this earlier. This is one of those cases of asymmetric paternalism, where these highly restrictive accounts, say with a penalty of 100% for early withdrawal, so no one withdraws early, there's no benefit to doing so, they barely hurt the perfectly rational beta equals 1 households. But they enormously benefit the households that are out of control. And so we end up with a world where, from a social planner's perspective, we're much better off with these restricted accounts, even though a lot of the population is perfectly rational, or nearly perfectly rational. They're barely damaged by this illiquidity in this model. Again, the model makes a lot of assumptions, but in this model, they're barely hurt if they have beta close to 1, and they're enormously benefited if they have beta far away from 1. And that's why, essentially, the right answer for this economy is just constrain people, because it's hard to pull them apart. And we know in this model that we want consumption smoothing, or near consumption smoothing. We achieve that with highly illiquid retirement accounts. Okay, now, we can also calibrate the model to reproduce the leakage patterns that we see in the data. I mentioned the Argento, Bryant, and Sablehouse data. And we can also think about how to improve welfare from the status quo that we have right now in the US, which of course is not as simple as just liquid accounts or just a 10% penalty. In the US right now, we have some illiquid accounts, Social Security, and we have some partially liquid accounts, 401k accounts with a 10% penalty. Well, what would we do if we took the US in its current state and we kind of changed policy to maximize the welfare of agents in the stylized model that I've just shown you? And the answer is we could get, in theory, a 2.7% welfare gain using a money metric if we were to take the US status quo and make the retirement system substantially more illiquid. And there's lots of ways to do that that all are equivalent in the context of this model. So we could have very aggressive matching in 401k plans, so people would put money into those plans even if they felt that they needed the money right now. The matching incentives would be so strong that they would jump in anyway. We could use non-contingent contributions, so that just says, hey, it doesn't matter what you want to do, 10% of your salary, 10% of what you get paid goes into the account, whether you like it or not. That's what happens at this employer. Indeed, that's what happens at Harvard and at many firms with defined benefit plans. And then, of course, we would need to make DC plans, or at least part of the DC system, completely illiquid so that the money stays in those accounts to retirement. That doesn't say make all accounts illiquid, it just says use illiquidity more aggressively in the welfare framework that you've just seen. And then, if you think, gosh, isn't this aggressive policy, I just want to remind everyone that the US and Canada are kind of outliers in the global economy. Indeed, it turns out Ontario province is like the rest of the world. But I think Quebec province is much like the US, if I understand the system correctly. Someone here can correct me if I don't get it right. But the US and Quebec province have a lot of liquidity in retirement accounts, whereas if you go to continental Europe or Australia or Singapore, you have the kind of illiquidity that this model calls for. So, in fact, I think that kind of aggressive illiquidity is not such a strange thing. So, I've shown you two papers. The first is a mea culpa. We were too optimistic about the effect of nudges, and at least optimistic with respect to their effect sizes on retirement savings. We can separately have a conversation about welfare, which was the second paper. But on the first paper, I also urge you to take a look at Taha's 2024 forthcoming ADR paper, which is also very much about the kind of limited impact of 401k plans and nudges on wealth formation. And our current thinking is, well, what about going beyond the freedom-preserving nudges that became so popular in the US and globally? If we take seriously something like present bias, and we take seriously heterogeneity of present bias, then maybe we do want more paternalistic policies, which turn out to be globally the norm. it's the US and I think Quebec that are different. Most developed economies are much more restrictive than we are. So to sum up kind of a looking forward perspective, I'm not saying, and many people think at this point that I've said stop nudging, stop auto-enrolling, stop auto-featuring, stop auto-escalating. No, I'm not saying that. Those programs are succeeding, in our view, in very slightly increasing wealth formation. And even the money that spins out of those plans is obviously getting used for something. So it's not disappearing, it's just getting spent when people separate and go from job to job. And that might be a time when they kind of can use the liquidity. Now, I do think, picking up on Glenn's earlier suggestion, we need to think more about the structural models that live behind all of this. The old idea that people weren't saving enough and nudges were a great fix, I think we now need to really back away from and think about the various structural models, like Taha's forthcoming paper, that help us think about what policymaking should be doing. So for the moment, I'm still recommending that firms auto-enroll their workers and auto-escalate their savings rates in those retirement savings plans. But I'm acknowledging that, you know, the old narrative of how it was all working, I think is empirically wrong. And I do think we should think about other kinds of paternalism. So when I think about what we might do to make the 401k system better in the US and the RRSP system better in Quebec and Canada is to think more about, you know, putting restrictions on these savings accounts so that more of the money survives all the way to retirement. In the US right now, I'll give you a kind of amazing fact. The median household retires with $20,000 of retirement savings. And you know, when we work out simulations of what they should have under very modest savings rates without the money disappearing when they separate, we end up with vastly higher numbers, you know, 1 or 2 orders of magnitude. So I do think we should be contemplating restrictive policies, but in order to be more confident about their value societally, I think we should be exactly doing the kinds of structural modeling. Not that any structural model fundamentally is the final answer. The more I do economics, the more I'm skeptical of my own work, of my own empirical work, of my own structural models. But I do think we've got to think about all these issues, and I think more critically than we have in the past, because things that looked good in 2020, in 2004, look very different with the benefit of more data. So I'm going to stop there. I don't know if we have time for questions. I know we're behind schedule. Okay, great. So I'll try to go really quickly. So I'll just move across the room from this side to that side. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you. That was really a very interesting, exciting paper. But, you know, I've looked at data on the share of households with the DC accounts. And, you know, there's a huge increase in the 80s and into the 90s, and now it's really flattened out. And I think recently it's actually gone down. So I think that's really the problem. And it's not so much on individual behavior, but it's more on firms offering these plans. And that's where we see the real issue. So I think even though, you know, your ideas are really interesting, I think if you want to increase the share of families with these defined contribution accounts, you got to do something on the employer side.
Yeah.
And so that's where the real effort should be paid, rather than trying to nudge or, you know, alter individual behavior. So, you know, that's my thought on it.
Yeah. So in terms of DC plans as opposed to DB plans, there has been a huge explosion, and then, less, a vast expansion, this really should be maybe 2010. A vast expansion between 1980 and 2010, and then the availability of those plans really has stalled because the big firms all adopted them, and the little pizzerias have not. I'm going to keep going. Yeah. So yeah.
Yes, so in Australia, with 11.5% contribution rate, the savings are preserved to 60. What Australian households are doing, they are raking up more mortgage debt. When you look at the trajectory of these preserved savings and mortgage debts are almost parallel. They wait for that lump sum to clear their mortgage debt. So it's a form of saving, housing loss, but it's bad. People operate, and so we really, but we really need comprehensive modeling of the household decisions.
I couldn't agree more. We've got 2 papers on that subject. So we did a US paper with a big sample and found very little debt crowding in the US, but then we did another paper in the UK and found a 25 cents on the dollar debt crowding. So with respect to 401k or retirement savings, of course in the UK they don't call them 401ks. So yeah, I do think this speaks to this general issue of both getting more serious about the total household balance sheet empirically and more serious about the structural models that will enable us to put all the pieces together. We've got a lot of work to do. Yeah.
So putting both papers together, it looks like there could be a welfare gain of making the retirement account fully liquid, but then moments that people are changing jobs, they do need the liquidity, right? And I was thinking about the role of borrowing from your own retirement account there, because, it's the same. You have a liquidity shock, and then if you can pay it back to yourself, you can pay it back to yourself. But that could actually be the nudge that works. When I need the liquidity, I go and satisfy my needs, I find my new job, and now I feel obligated to make those payments to myself, and I'm handing interest to myself rather than handing interest to a financial institution. So I'm thinking, I know you don't want to talk about policy based on the sample model, but whether making them fully liquid, but also increasing the allowance for a 401k loan would be, in your eyes, welfare interest.
So let's exchange email, because we've got 2 papers exactly aligned with what you just said, and indeed another paper which is pretty close. So 2 already papers, and then a third. The third is about actually setting up 2 accounts for people. One account would be the perfectly illiquid, it's only there for retirement, you can't have it early. And a second account would be, this is being automatically taken out of your paycheck and put into a rainy day fund, which you can use when bad things come, like a separation or some other household shock. We're trying those out in England or the UK and finding they're working very well, at least so far. Big caveats around anything that's only a year old. So yeah, I do think that we can think more about maybe enriching the mental accounting system of these accounts, and through loans and through emergency savings, get to a better place where people are able to ride out these midlife liquidity events, not just the big liquidity event when people retire. And I'll, if you send me an email, I can send you a couple papers. So Todd, did you have your hand up? And then I'll go to Glenn.
So, I have a question. I just talk maybe about this. It has to do with your last one. And it feels that in this model, the most present-biased people would be willing to pay a lot of money for credit. And so I'm just wondering, I know the paper has so many robustness and extensions, and it's published now, but do you think this would would only work in a world where you could ban credit markets? Because there would always be someone who's willing to supply liquidity at a high enough interest rate.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, and that's kind of related, as you said, to the max debt 2024. Right, so if those very low beta households can go out and willy-nilly borrow, it may be that while we've locked up some savings in category A, they're off borrowing in another domain and actually making themselves worse off. And so it's precisely questions about the structural modeling that's going to help us figure out whether we've actually made them worse off by pushing them into these high interest rate markets One thing that I think is important that we don't talk a lot about in almost all the models we write down is the role of bankruptcy. So one constraint on borrowing is if I borrow $300,000 that's not collateralized at a high interest rate, I'm not the one who's in trouble. It's the lender. So I do think that there are constraints that exist endogenously in the credit market that prevent people from getting into the most profound trouble. But we might still end up with borrowing that's small amounts, like a payday loan of $300 that people roll over for years. But the damage from that is constrained. It's the $400,000 loan from a bookie that I'm more worried about. And we want to make sure that those bookies don't break kneecaps and that people can escape uncollateralized debt with bankruptcy. All, really important questions that deserve to be modeled, and it's far away from what we've done, and it should be done. Yeah, Glenn.
I just want to make a quick comment, and whilst I have very sharp negative answers to those which I've written on, I'll leave that apart. The thing that I love about your second paper...
Send me those results.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
The thing that I love about the second paper is the focus on distributional impacts as distinct from the average. This is my old teacher at UCLA, Ed Lima, would say, it's this Gaussianity that the profession has. We want to look at average effects. What you're seeing is when we bring in a welfare measure, and we have a distribution, in this case the unknown beta parameter, it could be any number of these things, we are doing harm in expectation, and it's in the tails. But we know who those tails are. They're not just amorphous error distributions out there. We know who they are, identifiable. That is scandalous from a welfare viewpoint. So I think that second paper demonstrates a separable point from this, if I may, and a great one, and that is look at the full distributions of these impacts. And that doesn't necessarily need a full-blown structural model. It just needs to carry those distributions along. And I think that's an important, valuable lesson.
We agree. And there's also, just following up on that, this interesting work on who is being affected by all the nudges and who's hurt, who's helped. It looks, we initially thought from the distributional perspective that it was low-income households that were being helped a lot by the nudges, but now we know that the offsetting effects that I discussed are essentially hitting the same low-income households. And so distributionally, the initial belief was that from a impact perspective, it was low-income households that were getting the biggest lift from the nudges, but now we know they're also getting the biggest unwinding as a consequence of the nudges. And so distributionally, a lot of the arguments in favor of the nudges that were distributional in nature, I think, are evaporating.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay,
Where are we doing on time?
You're 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Over, under.
So you didn't show it in the paper, but
He says it all
like
the
the
time.
cumulative separation rates, you didn't show what you have in the paper here, which is the cumulative separation rates. They're really, really high, like 50, 60, 70% over 4 years. To some extent, that's a separate problem though, right? I mean, there's broader implications beyond wealth accumulation for productivity and the global, the macro economy. So do you have like a comparative static on what your results look like for nudging as the separation rates were to go down? Like if you were to target separation rates instead, would nudging be more effective?
Well, yeah, if you change separation rates in the US labor market and made them much lower, these policies would produce
So
much more wealth formation.
is there a role for thinking about targeting separation rates? I mean, they've really skyrocketed. We've seen, the gig economy and just the transitions and changes in composition of the labor market over the last little while. Like, is this becoming a problem where we could be instead focusing our efforts on these other areas?
So I think that's interesting, and I'm open to that conversation. I do worry a little bit that might be the tail wagging the dog. I mean, I think the effects on wealth formation feel of second order to the effects on productivity, social networks, geographic relocation, all the things that separation produces. So yeah, I think we should think a lot about whether the super high rates of separation in the US economy are actually socially good, and whether there are things we should do, maybe not, to change that. But I would guess that the effects on wealth formation are better addressed directly through other channels of the sort we've discussed here, rather than thinking that we're gonna change separation rates because it would improve wealth formation. I think there's just direct ways to get at wealth formation that don't involve completely rewiring the labor market.
That's like an ass backwards connection too. I mean, you know, it seems we don't have the ability to make those connections. Anyway.
Okay, so there's one more hand, and then I think we definitely have to stop. Yes.
I love the presentation, love like the exposition and like, the overall take. One thing, and my hope is not to overcomplicate things, but like in a way, like housing is absent, like home ownership is absent in all these models, and in a way, it's kind of like you could think about them as like a forced saving mechanism that has like kind of like this like illiquidity aspect of it. And we have seen, especially in the US in the last 20 years, a massive decline in home ownership rate for like young people, which will be the retirees of the future. So I don't know if you have thought about that, if you have any kind of like.
So we have thought about it. There's a forthcoming paper in the QJE and a forthcoming paper in the Review of Financial Studies, both of which are about home ownership.
Okay.
So if you send me an email, and I'll send you PDFs. I think both of those things are still not available online. But they're they're positive papers. They're not normative papers. They're simply saying, we're going to bring present bias into the model, and then we're going to calculate all the moments and compare them to what we see in terms of wealth formation in liquid categories, like cash and credit cards, and wealth formation in illiquid categories, like home equity. And of course, as I think you're anticipating, in the present biased economy, we're going to see wealth formation overwhelmingly happening in illiquid assets. And I think it's another kind of insight into what's happening in the economy and into the preferences that are driving those empirical outcomes. And then, of course, we can think about policy making, keeping in mind Taha's excellent point about if you put a lot of water in this reservoir, it might create pressure and end up somewhere else. And that was your point too. I mean, it's so complicated because you touch one thing and so many other downstream forces emerge. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.